morning, everybody. As many of you will know, on the first full day of this conference, my wife Sally had a heart attack, and she is in hospital awaiting tests, and has been and will be very grateful for your ongoing prayers. But when it happened, before I gave my first talk, I said, "What now?" And she says, "Whatever happens, you do your talks." And that's the kind of woman she is. She has been a faithful companion for 56 years. And many of the things, indeed, most of the things that I've been able to do with the Lord's help have come with her help and encouragement. It is marvelous when one comes to the story of Joseph and has to deal with rather unpleasant topics like sexual misdemeanor, to know that there is a positive side and that husbands and wives can serve together and serve the Lord together. And I noticed yesterday that there's a stand at this conference, and it is put up by the Daily Bread organization that gives out little notes. Sally, my wife, has sent those notes to at least 40 people once every 3 months for about 25 years. And they've made a tremendous difference in people's lives. And I'd like just to encourage you by one very positive point. The secret of the strength, I believe, of Christian marriages is when husbands and wives pray and read together. And I am utterly appalled at the number of people I meet, even in middle age, who are believers and keen believers, who do not read and pray together. Marriage needs to be a triangle between me and my spouse and the Lord. So if you don't have any notes that are simple, don't take a long time, you go to the little stand of the Daily Bread people and have a chat with them. Now we're going to read the passage where I left off last time, where Joseph is put under extreme sexual pressure. And what I want you to notice is where it happened. It happened in his workplace. That's often where sexual temptation, particularly for men, happens, in the workplace, where a young woman perhaps comes into the office who's very beautiful and young, and the CEO has a wife who's showing her age now, and he ends up going off with the young woman and destroying the family, destroying the children, out of utter selfishness, simply as his apparent need, as he might say, to satisfy himself sexually. Now, I'm very aware that in this current age, we've seen a revolution in sexual dynamics, so that, as I mentioned the other day, sex is not simply something that is done, it forms people's identities. And there's been an extreme move to subjectivize people's identity. So it's what we feel, and the moral norms completely disappear. Now, this is a huge issue and is being dealt with in some of the seminars. But I want you simply to note that Joseph's basic principle was that he wouldn't sin against God and do this wicked thing, as he called it. He still believed, as many do, in objective norms of moral behavior. And that is the crucial thing and the crucial lesson here. All sin is ultimately against God, even though other people may be involved. And she put the pressure on, did Potiphar's wife. And when we read in 39:11, it says, "But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, 'See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house.' As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, 'This is the way your servant treated me,' his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Joseph fled out of the situation. And that's the advice that Paul gives to us in these kind of circumstances. Flee youthful desires. There are some situations in life where the only way to deal with them is to get out. Now, that has various ways of understanding, because getting out may mean switching off a computer. It may mean not taking this next click that will lead you onto Pornhub. And you know, I've often thought about it. Most of us are only 2 clicks away from disaster. It's that close. And it's all around us. 2 clicks away from disaster. Yet the Lord encourages us not to take those steps and those clicks. He couldn't switch her off, but he could run. And as he ran, he left his garment. And now, once again, we're faced with the question of garments and what they represent. They represented Joseph. He was a high official now, even though a slave. And his garment would have identified him immediately. And so she, and it's interesting, she uses the race card. Did you notice that? This Hebrew servant. And that is a very common thing, sadly, today. And she showed it to her husband when he came home. And one of the interesting things here is normally the immediate punishment for adultery would be death and execution. And the very fact that Potiphar didn't do that is an indicator that he suspected that there might be more to the story than his wife had told him. Joseph fled because he had a central focus outside of himself and outside of his world on God. The famous atheist writer Nietzsche once said something that I found very interesting for many years. He said, "Those who know why they live can endure almost any how. Those who know why they live can endure almost any how. And if you don't know why you're living, then under this kind of temptation, you may well simply fall to pieces. So let's face ourselves with that question. Why am I living? It was a big question for Joseph, of course, because his life had already so many ups and downs. Now, it interests me again that his clothing is used to identify him. We've had this again and again now in this story. Clothing used as evidence because it was something that was part of Joseph. But it was used to construct a lie. It was used to construct fake news. And the tragedy of today is that our clothing, or may I just change the imagery slightly, a picture of us and the tonefall of our voice are enough to create a deep fake image that can be used to represent us talking lies or saying anything that the manipulators want us to say. This is a very primitive version of it. Using evidence, it really was Joseph's cloak. It identified him, but then it's used to give fake evidence to the servants and to Potiphar as well. And I'm afraid this situation is getting worse and worse. And we need to understand just what is happening with misrepresentation and faking of human personality. And that's why I wrote my second book with the title 2084. So this could be studied at much greater depth. And that, by the way, is why I wrote a book on Joseph. You see, not all I'm saying to you today is contained in these talks. There's very much more in the book. So if you want more, you know what to do. Now, of course, we have to face the fact, and it is another thing and would take a whole talk, but we have to recognize that many of us fail where Joseph stood. King David failed where Joseph stood. He saw a beautiful woman and he fell for her. And there's a lot that could be learned from his story because two things happened. First of all, David learned when he repented and admitted his sin that the Lord was prepared to forgive him. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven and whose iniquity is covered. He learned as a result of it. But he had to learn another thing, that sin, even if repented of and forgiven, has consequences. And those consequences cannot be forgiven because they're in a different category. And David had to live all the rest of his life, although forgiven, with the consequences of that sin. If I get drunk and drive my car and smash into you and wreck your spine, you may be left paraplegic, but you can still speak. And as a believer, perhaps after years, you may get to the stage where you're prepared to forgive me, but you'll still be paraplegic until you get to heaven. And we need to remember those two things. And I'll be dealing with forgiveness in much more detail tomorrow. But it is important to realize that there is forgiveness for sexual sin of this kind. And of course, in an audience like this, there are bound to be people who are struggling with these issues. The wonderful thing about the Christian gospel is that it is a gospel of forgiveness. Christ died not just for my sins in the past, but for all of my sins. And the reason I'm sitting here as a Christian is because Jesus Christ offers me something that no one else offers me. He doesn't compete with any other religion because none of them offer me a forgiveness that I can know on this earth, a certainty of it, because it doesn't depend on my works or efforts, but on what he did for me on the cross and in his resurrection, so that I can sit here and be certain that I will be with him one day in heaven. That's wonderful news. And anyone here this morning can enter into it without further ado. There is a power to the message of the gospel and forgiveness. But all this lay in the future when we're thinking of the life of Joseph. The topic of forgiveness will feature greatly in what follows. Joseph ends up in the prison, and what does he do? Does he moan? It seems quite remarkable here that he continues to be a faithful servant. Now, he was a slave to start with and rose to running Pharaoh's entire estate, which must have been huge. Now he's put in the prison, and instead of complaining, we certainly don't read of it, he sets to work to do what he can. And in the end, he becomes essentially the prisoner who governs a prison from the inside, which is a very rare thing. And if you know anything about prisons, you realize that translating this up to date would almost be impossible to imagine. Joseph is now running the place. And the next development is that sometime after this, in chapter 40, it says, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked them, Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? That is staggering. Would you have noticed their faces if you were in prison unjustly? I don't think I would. The utterly remarkable thing is that Joseph was not bound up with his own feelings of irritation, of desires for revenge. He was not wound up in a high emotional tension thinking of how he could get his own back. He noticed that these men were sad. Now, some of you might have a lot to complain about in life. It's so easy for us to become the center of our own life, and we don't notice when people around us are exhibiting signs of being sad. We get upset over the most trivial things, even parking cars. Can we observe and think of folks around us today that might be looking sad? And by asking them, he was inviting them to reveal the source of their sadness. Joseph had a wonderful pastoral heart. He had every reason to be shut up in himself and silent and not interested in anybody else, because everything that had happened to him so far was unjust, unfair, unreasonable, untrue. And yet he noticed these men. And they told him that they dreamed. And he said, well, why don't you tell me your dreams? And it becomes really fascinating, because they said, oh, we've had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. They felt that there was some meaning in their dreams. And Joseph's reply, do not interpretations belong to God? Well, what did they make of that? Please tell them to me. And so they each told their dream, and Joseph interpreted them immediately and told one, the chief cupbearer, that he was going to be reinstated within 3 days. And he told the baker that he was going to be executed within 3 days. One was good news, the other was bad news. And he was faithful to the interpretations of both. But just a minute. Joseph had had dreams. Would you not have thought that when these men said, we've had dreams, he'd have said, oh, chaps, look, forget it. It was the rotten cheese that we ate for dinner last night. Dreams, nonsense. I had dreams when I was a teenager. They came to nothing. Forget your dreams. What does that tell me? His reaction tells me he still believed his own dreams. They hadn't been fulfilled yet, but he still held on to the fact that those words of God by dream years ago, an imagery that he couldn't understand, of the sheaves bowing and so on, he still believed in them, and therefore he could tell these men that their dreams were worth interpreting. And so he interpreted them. And very gently, he said that when the chief cupbearer got his job back, he said, only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Please remember me when you get out. And got out. And there's a delightful little thing here that in the imagery of the dream, he was squeezing grapes into Pharaoh's cup. Do you know why he was doing that? Because these ancient emperors tend to drink too much alcohol. And one of the jobs of the chief cupbearer was to dilute it with fresh grape juice without being noticed and squeeze a few grapes into the man's drinking jar in the hope of retaining his alcoholic rages. And another mark of authenticity here in the text, because that's exactly what happened in the ancient world. So Joseph, of course, is still in the prison, and the chief cupbearer goes back to his job. And the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Can you imagine the day after Joseph had interpreted the cupbearer's dream and he'd gone back to his job, Joseph sitting in the prison wondering, I wonder when the knock will come on the door. And it didn't come that day. It didn't come the next day. It didn't come at the end of the week. It was after 2 years of waiting that Pharaoh's birthday occurred. And he had a dream. And it was then that the cupbearer remembered what had happened in the prison. Would you have held out? Would I have held out, or would I have been screaming inside myself, how long, O Lord, have I got to wait? How long have I got to put up with this? Is there no justice and fairness in the world ultimately? I have stood for truth. I've stood for morality. And this is what has happened. I've seen a glimmer of a door opening and it's been shut in my face. And I'm still in this prison. I just find it remarkable that he had held on. But then Pharaoh dreams, and the chief cupbearer gets very embarrassed, and he has to go and remind Pharaoh of his sins, which wasn't a very easy thing for him to do, because Pharaoh might have, in rage, put him in prison again. But nevertheless, he felt that he had to do that, and he goes and tells Pharaoh about Joseph in the prison. And he tells him the detail. And Pharaoh's dream is explained to us in the detail of it in chapter 41. And in verse 9, the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night. And so he explained what's going on. He says, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. And Pharaoh believed him, and he sent and called Joseph. And they quickly brought him out of the pit. It must have been some awful prison, if it can be described as a pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, why do you think he'd shaved himself? Because at that period, in the Egyptian dynasties, leaders didn't shave. They were clean shaven. Most of the pictures we see of the ancient world, leaders have beards. But at this time, they didn't. And so there's a little touch here of Joseph making himself ready to meet the emperor of the world, the then known world of Egypt. He changed his clothes. He came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. And I can imagine he paused. It is not in me, Your Majesty. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. That's magnificent. All his life has been geared to those 10 seconds that it took to say, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Think of the Olympic 100-yard sprint final. All of life, the athlete is trained for those 10 seconds or less, hopefully, looking down the straight. And all of Joseph's life up to this point, all the deprivation, all the suffering, all the misrepresentation, all the false accusation, all the life in prison, all of that is geared to these 10 seconds. Will the emperor listen? And now we begin to see how God is going to bring salvation through the Hebrews to the world. It was only part of the world, but it was a seriously important part of the world at that time. He's going to bring it through this young, trained Hebrew who didn't yet know what his own dreams meant. But he proved that he could interpret dreams. And God would give him the answer to some dreams. And so Joseph said that God would give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And Pharaoh relates the dreams to Joseph, and we know what they are. It was a double dream. He first of all saw cows, plump and attractive, come out of the Nile and feeding in the reed grass. And then 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them up, because they were still as ugly as at the beginning. And then I awoke, and the second dream came. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, immediately, without hesitation, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Pharaoh must have been terrified, because the Pharaoh was supposed to be the one that governed the inundation of the Nile, which was vitally important for the economy of Egypt. All of its agriculture depended on the River Nile and its flooding at the right time of the year. And the pharaohs feared for their lives in case the Nile inundation wouldn't occur at the right time. And the idea of something coming out of the Nile that wasn't working properly, these thin cows that ate up the very luxuriantly well-fed cows, and the ears of corn similarly, indicated, even to Pharaoh they must have, that something was going to go desperately wrong with the Nile harvest. And he was in charge. He was supposed to represent the god Happy, who was the god of the Nile. And he must have been devastated. And Joseph starts explaining what God is telling him. A young Hebrew. I'd love to have been there, wouldn't you? To watch as Pharaoh suddenly recognized that the young man in front of him had access to knowledge that Pharaoh himself and all his magicians and experts had no access to. The same thing happened with Daniel in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And Pharaoh, and you can sense it as you read through the detail of all of these verses as they go on, you can sense that Pharaoh is coming to a dawning realization that he's standing in front of something utterly unique in his own experience, and he's standing in front of an authority that he doesn't even begin to possess, even though he's the Lord of Egypt. It's a devastating realization for a man with the kind of power an ancient emperor had. And Joseph interprets the dreams. And he interprets them in terms of, verse 29, there will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. He was asserting several things here to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, there is a God that stands way above all the plethora of gods of the Egyptians, including the Nile itself and you. And he is going to bring it about. He is behind what's going to happen. Now, that raises all kinds of questions, of course. I know about that. And we have to take those on board at some time or other. God behind history. And it's spectacular when you think about it that God is moving in history and a whole land has got to be brought to its knees in order to bring 10 men to their knees. Those are God's sense of proportion. But we're not there yet. And as Joseph starts to explain, he goes on, he doesn't stop. I'm often intrigued just how the flow of this speech went. The thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Now Joseph has taken over commanding the emperor. Without pause or hesitation, he's now running the show. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Now he's taking over the job of Minister of Finance, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and suggesting exactly what level of taxes are to be imposed. That's familiar to us as well. You see, Joseph has been a steward in all senses, an economos, a man who understands the laws of the house, but he's understood finance because he's been responsible for paying the slaves under his command when he was running Potiphar's house. And clearly he understood a great deal of how economics works. Now, I'm not an economist. And I'm not going to risk giving you a lecture on economics here, but I want to tell you this, that there's been masses of literature written about the tax proposals that are made here by Joseph. Some people think they are extremely unfair because as you read down, it ended up with all the grain and all the property belonging to Pharaoh. And that's not always a very good system in economic history. But I leave you to the fun of chasing this topic through the internet, but it's a very, very big topic. But the first thing that Joseph suggested was, you gather the food, you tax it so that you keep a proportion back, build store cities against the years of famine. Now, just think what that means. There's a young man standing in front of Pharaoh. The land is full of plenty at the moment. And he is claiming that there are going to be 7 years of wonderful harvest, and then there's going to be a famine of disaster. But you're only going to build store cities if you believe what he says. You wouldn't do it otherwise. What a crazy thing. And yet Pharaoh, it seems he's pretty subtle. No doubt he's standing in front of all his ministers, and they are wondering, what is the emperor going to do now with all of this? What are we going to do with all of this? Is he going to run a consultation with us? And we'll set up a few committees, and we'll have a commission, and we'll report next year as to what we're going to do. But he's shrewd, and he cuts right through any other ministerial suggestions. And he said, since God has shown you. What did he mean by God? What did he understand? Well, he certainly must have understood enough that this God was above all other gods and totally different. God has shown you all this. There's none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. There was no commission. There was no discussion. There was nothing. Direct command of the emperor takes a prisoner and puts him in charge of the entire nation immediately. And why did that happen? Because he believed God. And God was going to use him to save the nation and to save his brothers. Well, we need to reflect just a little bit, because behind this story, there is, of course, a huge problem that has exercised people's hearts and minds for centuries. It's the problem of unfairness. It's the problem of good and evil. And although Scripture doesn't, for a very good reason, go into it at this point precisely, I want to say something about it that may help you in dealing with other people. You see, the problem is this: God saved the Egyptians, but it didn't save everybody. And when Jesus was on earth, he healed many people, he cured many people, but he didn't cure everybody. And the same is true today. Some people pray and the Lord heals them. Wonderful. But others pray and the Lord takes them to glory. It's a mixed bag. And the thing that rises up in many human hearts is simply this: if there is a good God and he's all powerful, surely he would solve the problems of the world, and my problem in particular. And I just want to cut to the heart of this as I close. Whatever worldview, religion, philosophy we have, it must take into account that what we see is a mixed picture. We see beauty and we see bombs in our world today. And we've got to take account of that. No philosophy that doesn't recognize that there is a mixed picture. And then we argue, especially when we're students, till late at night. Surely a good God would, could, might, and we never get anywhere, do we? I used to do that, still do sometimes with people. But have you ever found a satisfactory answer to that question? And the answer is no. Now, I have a bit of an advantage here because I'm a mathematician. You don't think that mathematicians have much advantage in life, but I have. When we try to solve a problem for several hundred years and fail, we realize that maybe we're looking at the wrong problem. And I think that's true here. I think there's another question we can ask. It's equally difficult, but it gets us further, and it's this. Granted that it's a mixed picture, is there anywhere enough evidence that we can trust God with it? Now, that's just as hard a question, but it gets us further because I believe there is. And it comes straight to the cross of Christ. Because if we ask about suffering and evil, the Bible introduces us, both in prophecy and in living reality, to a God who suffers. And if Jesus Christ is God, we may ask the question, what is God doing on a cross? And I remember, and I'll finish with this story, standing in a synagogue in Budapest. And on the date of my birthday in 1943, there were a line of bullet holes at chest height around the backyard of the synagogue where the Nazis had murdered dozens of Jews. And I'd fallen into talking with a Jewish woman, an architect from South America, and I'd been trying to help translate the Yiddish, which is a kind of German, into Spanish so that she could understand the talk that was being given about the festivals of Jehovah. And that moved around the room. And of course, I took translator's license and I was adding a little bit to everything. So we talked about Passover, and I talked about Israel being saved by the Passover. And then I added a little bit that Jesus turns out to be the Passover lamb, and so on we went. But in the middle, there was a door. And there was a photo montage in the door of the brutal experiments of Josef Mengele in Auschwitz. And the doorway was made to resemble the doorway of Auschwitz, where I'd been many times. Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. I'll never forget this young woman, because we'd been chatting, and she went and stood in the doorway and raised her arms in the form of a cross like this. And she stopped. And she said, "What does your religion make of this?" There was dead silence, of course, because she said it loudly. What would you have said? Many of her relatives had perished in the Holocaust. And I, of course, lifted my heart to heaven. And what I said was this. I said, I wouldn't dream of insulting the memory, your memory of your loved ones. And what I'm going to say is going to be very difficult, but you've asked me. So try and come with me. You've heard me say that Yeshua, Jesus, was the Messiah. She said, yes. And I said, the hardest thing for you to even get your head around is his claim to be God incarnate. But just come with me for a moment. If he is God incarnate, what is God incarnate doing on a cross and suffering? I said, surely this at least tells us this. If this is God, God has not remained indifferent to human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And there was dead silence. She began to weep, and she said, why has no one ever told me this about my Messiah before? It was very dramatic. You see, at the cross, love and mercy meet, and we see a God who takes upon himself suffering. Now, there's a lot more that can be said. If he'd remained on the cross, as I went on to say, we'd never have heard of him. But on the third day, God raised him by his mighty power from the dead, and that changes everything. Because it means that God has a solution, an ultimate solution to the problem of suffering and death. And it means that a good news can be preached, that all those who will face that it is in part their own sin that put Jesus on the cross, that he died there for them, that if they trust him, they can receive in that instant a full and free pardon, and be guaranteed that one day they too will be raised from the dead. It's the power of the resurrection that shows us what the world to come is going to be like. Our bodies decay and die. We might have to live with all sorts of disabilities. But one day, for the Christian, they'll be gone because Jesus will speak and give us all new bodies. There's no competition. There's no other religion offers anything like it. So it's no offense if I receive something from Christ that nobody else offers me. And I've had that experience several times talking to Jewish people. There's something about lifting Christ up so that people can see him on the cross that begins to dissolve a lot of these deep problems that remain problems. But the solution to them is not philosophical. There are important philosophical considerations. I haven't time to go into them. I do that in many of my books. But the real thing is not the philosophy of God. It's what God did in Jesus Christ on the cross. And that's why I look at the story of Joseph. And in one sense, he prefigured some of this, but not all of it, because Joseph is not Jesus. And we need to come to that cross again, because there we can find pardon, healing, restoration for the things that flood into our mind, the things we've done, the things we've never got sorted out, but need to get sorted out and repent of. But it is the ultimate solution, that God has done something that will eventually dissolve this universe and create another one. And I'm going to be there, thanks to the grace of God. Are you? Thank you very much.